Hi, this is Roger Horowitz of the Hadley Center with another episode of the Hadley History Hangout, where we talk to scholars who have made use of our collections, and we ask them about the things they produce from them, how they've used our materials. Part of the Hadley History Hangout are interviews with authors who have published books out of our collection, and that falls to me and some other people do those interviews. So today we are going to be doing a book interview with Paula de la Cruz-Fernandez. Paula, thank you for being here on Zoom to talk with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paula has a number of roles in this world these days. Her PhD is at Florida International University, and I met Paula when she was doing research for it. And of course, we've had a lot of business since then, which I'll say things about. She has a few affiliations. She is with the University of Florida, working in the library archives there. She's currently, at this moment, teaching business history at the CUNEF in Madrid. What is the CUNEF?
It stands for Colegio Universitario de Estudios Financieros. It's like finance, business administration school.
Okay, so she's teaching in Madrid, and she is also the web editor, digital editor for the Business History Conference, where she maintains and operates really all the digital communications that the BHC engages in, helps in organizing virtual meetings and plans things, initiates things. So Paula has a lot that she does, and we do a lot together. So it's wonderful to talk about this book, Paula. Of course, it's like met you when you're writing this as a dissertation. This is great for me to see this between covers. So let me just start with a very basic, but question that we'd like to know: what got you here? What inspired you to write this book? Where did the inspiration come from?
Thank you, Roger. First I want to say thank you for this opportunity. It is it's an honor for me to talk about my book, and especially with you, which because you just mentioned, this is not the first time we meet. We've been colleagues for a while, and it's always an honor to work with Hagle and with you. So to respond to this question, I need to go back to my undergrad years and my graduate years, my graduate school years. So because I wasn't inspired by having a family of women that sew or having or being sewing something important in my family. Actually, it is quite the opposite. Sewing, I come from Spain. I'm a Spaniard, and my family, I was born in the 80s, so my family is a Spanish family living in this transition to democracy. And sewing was seen as an activity done by women, right? But also like a traditional activity, something that modern women, especially feminist women that now not under Franco's Spain, could do more than being, mothers and wives. It was done as something that if you did it was because of economic necessity or because you believed in this ideal of womanhood that had to be a wife and had to be a mother before anything else, right? It wasn't there, right? But I still I think that's important because I explain in the conclusion how this idea of domesticity and so on has evolved through time, and it still has meaning today in those terms. So, but when I started my BA in history and my MA also in history, I took courses on women's history and gender studies. And with time and research, I became very interested in this practice, right? In sewing and later in embroidering. But it was more when I studied more about sewing that I became interested also in embroidery. And so the idea is that sewing could bring me to all this spectrum of women right? Women that did it for the home, but also working women, and women that did it as a hobby, as a, kind of a creative activity. So I thought that was that was a good way of approaching this this female experience in the history of Spain. I consider myself partly a historian of Spain, but also a historian of Latin America. And so that's how, I became interested in costureras, in these people, and seamstresses. Costureras is more what we would you would call seamstresses, and dressmakers in Spanish is translated as modista, right? So dressmakers is a little bit higher in the skills, supposedly, and then costureras is more, that the people that would go to houses to sew, or that would have like contracted, like the put in our system, contracted material to sew and give it to someone else. Okay, and then of course, and then I went to grad school. I went to grad school in the US. I moved to Florida, and I got the chance to work with very good mentors, and one of them was one of my advisors, Professor Aurora Morcillo, who tragically passed away not very long ago, but who always would teach about how we should look at those that are in the margins, those that are not visible, those that serve our restaurant tables, those that clean our floors, and how they also had a role in history, right, in our research. And then also, of course, I need to mention Kenneth Lipartito and his approach to business through culture, right, through and the centrality of cultural values in the study of the firm. So kind of all that together, one day he talked about sewing machines, and I was like, well, the sewing machine was part of my research, but I had not thought about kind of the business history behind it, right? And so that's how, of course, I said, my grandmother had a singer. Everyone I talked to had a singer. I was like, okay, well, this is how you start a dissertation.
That's a great story of your intellectual path, to that topic, and finding a way into it. Well, the book title, which I will show you all and read it to you, is Gendered Capitalism: Sewing Machines and Multinational Business in Spain and Mexico, 1850 to 1940. And we'll now start picking that apart about the book and what it covers. Let me start with the title, Gendered Capitalism, which is a bold statement. And so for the moment, let's push aside the details on Singer and Mexico and all that, and talk to me about gendered capitalism. Why that title? What are you trying to say with that title?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So gendered capitalism was not the original title of my dissertation. It was not my dissertation title, and it was not, what I had envisioned the book title would be. But as I reviewed my dissertation and and prepared it for the book, I became convinced that what I was studying was how global capitalism worked in spaces that were commonly thought as private, as domestic, that were hidden, not officially hidden, but hidden even by us, right, by the people looking at the sources, because we perhaps thought that a tablecloth embroidered with beautiful flowers is not, something that is part of capitalism, of economic life, and and even less of economic development and industrialization, all these big words, right? So another kind of layer is the ideology of domesticity. which historians of gender and of women and culture, we were talking about this before, have researched it and have well understood it as hegemonic, right? And by this I mean culturally, and the mentality that dominated definitions of womanhood in the Western world, at least in the Hispanic world, at least since the 16th century. So that even though perhaps sometimes this ideology of domesticity is contested, is not practiced, is refused, it still was there, right, and informed economic life and practices. So I argue that this ideology was key to understand actually the business history of capitalism, the history of capitalism. And so in the book, I also talk about the gendered corporation, also kind of between gendered capitalism and gendered corporation. And for me, it's also kind of a different approach to our understanding of the firm, right? So I became a business historian by coincidence, right? By the back door. I think I should have studied some economics in my life. That would have helped me a lot with some of the concepts and contexts that I perhaps struggled. But I wasn't. I was a cultural historian. I was a gender historian, right? So when I started looking at the firm, and I understood that the firm is is an institution that wants to lower costs and control the market, and I thought that also this approach of including the other in a very broad sense was necessary, right? So, and by the other, I mean a lot of others. I mean women, of course. I mean these private spaces, right? Like that domesticity or ideas of domesticity describe, but also Spain and Mexico, right? Spain and Mexico are not part of mainstream histories of capitalism. They are not industrialized, they came late. When they came, it was because of a miracle, right? It's all kind of put on the margins, it's all peripheral, and and what else? There's a lot of others. There's also sewing and embroidery, right? Because these were gendered and sometimes private practices. They were also, hadn't been looked at as a practice, as a cultural practice, a meaningful practice in other histories of Singer. They were looked at in other histories, for example, of women's work, right? So I draw a lot of from that historiography as well. And I guess the last other is marketing, and I'll explain this better in that I mean, but what I mean by marketing, I mean this connection with consumers, right? So what role do consumers have in the history of the corporation and the history of the multinational? And for the case of Singer, at least, marketing had not been at the center, even though the distribution system had been studied fairly well. Marketing for Singer was much more than just the salesman going door to door. It was, it was the stores, it was the exhibits, it was the schools that women developed later. So it was much, it was a very complex system of this, wanting to connect with the consumer than I thought had not been studied well because of this kind of put aside because it was not important, right? It was that kind of idea that that was not too important for this male-dominated firm or management, to say it, but I think.
Well, just sort of a comment on what you said, especially the last part of markets, this session I just told you, I was just in a conference, I made a pitch for the importance of thinking of markets, because when you think about markets, you have to think about cultural constructions. Markets are not created because of, they're not there.
Right.
They're manufactured, they're created, they're discovered, they are messed with. And bringing markets in seemed to me to be a critical element of this gendered capitalism that you want to talk about. Because thinking about markets open the door to thinking about a variety of considerations as to how a certain kind of market could form. Complex, varied, but yet much more involved in what was going on internal to a firm's operations.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about Singer then. I mean, one thing that you say very clearly, you don't stress it, but you say this unmistakably, that Singer was controlled by men. The company management is all men. And the people who are assigned to run and oversee the company in Spain and Mexico are men. And women have a role there, but they're not in management. Yet, you give women a tremendously important place in Singer's activities. So explain to us how women were influential, even with the hierarchy being all men.
Yeah, so that's also why I start, the book with the 1850s. I have this. In the 1850s, or let's say 1840s, when Singer and other inventors were, patenting their mechanisms for sewing, they were actually asking women to test it, right? They were asking the seamstresses to test it, and at some point, they perhaps during those decades, the idea that the market was going to be home sewing, the importance of home sewing, it perhaps wasn't so clear, right? Because for the most part, the first sewing machines were used to create clothes for uniforms for the army, or perhaps in hospitals to create bigger amounts of clothes and linens. But very early in the history of Singer, the family sewing machine, which was that could fit in a house and could be used for home sewing, was by the late 1850s, it was already the main machine that they produced. But not only that they produced, it was the only really real machine that they invested marketing on, right? Because the industrial machines were there was not such a need of marketing. Although, for example, these trade journals that are available at Hagley do have a very important, do document this conversation between manufacturers and sewing machine makers. But so since the early history of Singer, women would be, for example, at showrooms. Women would be showing other people how to use the sewing machine for family sewing, for example. And I have found documentation for the case of the US that also that they prepared these little exhibits in each of these stores, regularly. They also had a very big role, which would make them then be part of the managerial of the managerial structure. They also were part of the first international exhibits, and they stood there. They showed, they prepared the display, which was very important, of course, because whatever you had to put on display was decided by women, because they supposedly they understood why you would decorate a house, or you would create, the clothes for the newborn and things like that. So they were there, and then officially, they made it to the firm's hierarchy in the 1890s with this creation of the embroidery department, which was, which would take care of what I just said, like all the marketing parts of the business. So the stores, the exhibits, and the demonstration, right? And demonstrations. And then, so since then, they were, already part of the firm. Abroad, so this was in the United States, abroad, I could not find, in the sources, like one letter by the embroidery department in Spain, let's say, but there are sources like manuals or exhibits or mentions to, profesoras, which was the instructors that women were creating and being part of all the way. And that is, kind of the official involvement of women. And yeah.
Well, they're the interface of the market.
Exactly.
And that's very clear. But you also hint that, maybe you're saying this or not, that to some extent the actual technology and the way the machine is designed and some innovations are, maybe they're done by men, but they're based upon a women's practices. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Well, especially because of this idea of the home, and that is one of the first technologies that could be a home appliance as well, and that could be part of housework. So, but also this, all these, the way I also kind of include women and gender in the story is with all this context that was being prepared and being published and being, on display about sewing and embroidery. It was all related to this, ideology of the perfect woman being that woman that is, that takes care of the house, that is a household manager, kind of that is also a mother, that teaches her daughters to also sew. So it's all this kind of family and less official gift giving and social, cultural system of meanings that kind of, lifted the idea of having a sewing machine and the idea of sewing and embroidery in the house. Or, in Latin America, for example, a lot of times the sewing machine was right outside the house, right? Still close to the house, but you see that perhaps because of how it was used by many other people in the town, for example, it's one sewing machine. But that's also how I try to incorporate women in the story.
Well, talk more about embroidery. You've mentioned it several times. It fills a chapter in some of your award-winning articles about how do you use embroidery in the story analytically, and then what does it tell you? What does embroidery, focusing on embroidery, tell you about this gendered capitalism of Singer?
Mm-hmm. Well, so embroidery is a very interesting industry, right? The way Singer used it was very early on when social reformers were concerns about women outside the house, outside the home, and they took the practice as kind of to show that sewing and embroidery, right, these home practices were also art. They were practices that women could do and demonstrate creativity, and not just, their gendered or female appropriate practices. So the idea that, and so Singer would, for example, focused a lot in exhibitions with embroidery. They would, the exhibitions that women created were very much focused on frames, right? Or very, very intricate embroidery, fine embroidery that was made with a sewing machine, right? So it served that purpose of demystifying again, uplifting sewing as something that was not only work, it was creative, it was art. In the case of, for example, in gift giving and family practices, embroidery has a very powerful meaning because, for example, when there's a newborn, families would have to create the ajuar, which is not called ajuar for babies, but it's kind of this set of towels and bed sheets and a little bit of clothes, and that would be part of that would be given to that baby born. And it was either the mother or the grandmother or the aunt, it was the women of the family who would make that for that specific child. And embroidery served to decorate that, right? To ornament all that sewing and make it beautiful and make it, this idea to define it as something that, and also kind of permanent, right? If you just create bed sheets that are all white and have nothing in them, then there's no meaning that attaches, the person that made it to the object. So embroidery did that, right? And kind of threaded that idea that there was the women in the family had made it. And it was also done, very importantly, for weddings. So a woman would, in the case of Spain and in Mexico, a woman would make their own dowry, which it could be translated to dowry it's ajuar. It's like the group of gifts.
Use the word trousseau, I think, in your book. Is that correct? The trousseau.
Right, the trousseau. That's right, exactly. That I forgot the name in English, but well, that's kind of a French.
It is French, but we've stolen French.
It is understood, yes. So that's it, right? So it was women themselves who made it for themselves, for their wedding, or again, the women of the family, right? So in this case, it was very important to always have the initials to the lettergrams, right? To the how do you call them in English? Monograms?
Monograms.
Right. And you would put the initials of the husband and and the wife, and all of the set would be the same way with this embroidery. Also, tablecloths, right? So everything related to the house that woman was going to be managing very soon after getting married had to be embroidered, because to kind of get that symbolism. So Singer had all this library of manuals to how to do this. The profesoras and instructors, in Mexico, in Spain, but also in the United States, had to, knew how to teach this, and it was part of their curriculum. It was, and that gave, I believe that gave a very special place to Singer among other competitors. They could not, they did it so early. They catch on that link, between embroidery, art, and the home so fast that until well into the late 1930s, 1940s, Singer did not find a competitor really for its sewing machines.
Well, with the embroidery, just a follow-up question. one of the pictures you present is the extent to which these vernacular embroidery practices, like the one you described, are assimilated by Singer into its prescriptive literature. How does that happen? Where this is the larger point about the gendered capitalism, that women have these practices. Singer is riding with those practices. How does it actually work itself out, this dynamic between women's practices and Singer's sort of, if you will, marketing in this area of embroidery?
Right. So I think there's a very like kind of direct way, which is again these women, being part of the company, even though we don't have records of them being on the salary page, right, on the salary records. Although we do for the United States, there's 2 boxes in the archives that have that. But for the case of, but again, is this kind of system, right, of cult of values, of meanings that was contextual to Singer's development and kind of evolution of marketing strategies and management that could not be separated, and it may have happened organically, right? I mean, if there is a contextual idea that we are going to focus on home sewing and this is key, we all know, it's not that we all know that, but it's kind of it kind of becomes it had to become central to their decision making and conversations about who were the buyers of sewing machines.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that at some point, 20s, 30s, embroidery fades a bit and dressmaking becomes more important in Singer's activities. Why does that happen? How does that happen? That there's and I mean, it reflects partly the breadth of your book. You're going 90 years, and one of the things that you are able to do is manage this change. Some changes over time, significant changes, and one of them is this shift. So how does this shift take place, and how does it still work inside your analytic frame that you're doing?
Right. So again, I mean, part of the foundation of my book, I think, is that we cannot detach this history of the corporation from everything else, right? So in the 1920s, 1930s, there is a change related to what is the role of women in society, right? It's the birth of the modern women. We see more women working outside. We see the first suffrage movements being successful. We see this idea of the independent woman being more taken, right? Like followed. And then, but on the other side, and then also this is the time when this formalization of gender specific vocational schooling and education kind of becomes clear, right? And it happens in the US with home economics. It happens in Spain. It happens in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, when this idea of the modern woman is socialist, is independent, but is still the mother of and so yes, you could have skills, right, to make yourself marketable, I guess you could say, or if it's needed, you could participate in in some exchange with your work. But still, that vocational education, which is very much directed to to professionalize certain jobs for women, is going to be focused on sewing and embroidery. And but embroidery kind of is put aside because it is it's more related now to this idea. This embroidery is now how you learn or how you become introduced into women's roles, right? So when you're small, you start embroidering, and then cutting and making clothes requires much more skills if it's not artistic, right? And so that's what schools would teach you, and not embroidery. Even though, you know, it was assumed that these women that went to schools for home economics or for just dressmaking, they would already know, you know, kind of the basics of embroidery and basting, right, which is the use of the steel with the needle, like to make the lines to then put it in the sewing machine.
Now you mentioned too, I mean, partly this shift was also about women's role, which you alluded to at the beginning.
Yeah.
Embroidery emphasizes much more the sort of the ornamentation, the personalization of white goods and other kinds of products there. But what's peculiar about the dressmaking phase is this is taking place at the same time that in the literature we know that ready-to-wear women's clothing is much more widely available. So,
yeah.
you know, so to some extent, there's something puzzling here about how, you know, given the rise of ready-to-wear women's wear, why is dressmaking becoming increasingly popular and effective for Singer as a marketing device for its machines?
Well, so in the case of Spain and Mexico, ready-to-wear clothing or industry is not available until much later. There are of course factories that you know that produce ready-to-wear clothes, but it's mostly very simple clothes. I mean, very you know, it would be like t-shirts, things that are like for regular wear, but not kind of more formal clothing, right? In the case of Spain, for example, people would still go to the modista, to the dressmaker. Of course, if you were of a kind of middle class, upper class level, even in the 1980s, right, in 1970s and 80s. That's, I don't think, the case for the US. And then in Mexico is the same, right? It's really late in late, you know, as perhaps in comparison to the US, but it's later in the 1960s, 70s when there is more, you know, kind of openness to foreign investment, that there is more ready to wear. But for the most part, in rural areas, even in the small towns, perhaps in Madrid, perhaps in Mexico City, there were department stores, right, with some of this clothing, ready-made clothing, but it was very delayed in the case of Spain and Mexico. So for the most part, people made and repaired their clothes in the house. They would have you know, in the home, and they would, or within a very, with not so commercialized, in a not so commercialized space, like a department store or things like that. It would be very much like within communities, like, you know, small stores perhaps, that would provide the different tools, and materials. But also, you know, this ready-made clothing it was also before the 19th century, and there were also factories in Mexico and Spain for ready-made clothing, and you know, it still was not the norm to get your clothes in these places. So just perhaps, you know, some of the clothes, perhaps just, you know, the t-shirt, the underwear, things like that.
Well, that your answer raises the question that the the rise of ready-to-wear in the West is associated with the rise of the fashion system. That ready-to-wear intersects with the growth of fashion and style and all that. Is that happening in a different way in Mexico and Spain? In other words, is the intersection of style and fashion intersecting instead with the rise and expansion of dressmaking by women in either the home or small businesses and things like that? In other words, in a different sort of pattern than might happen in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I would say, yes, it is happening along these lines, along with, this idea, this development of fashion as also something that would make, if a woman made it herself, could, also showed independence and skills. I was thinking also for the case of Japan, Andrew Gordon has studied, the introduction of the sewing machine, and I believe that the fashion industry also developed really fast from the introduction of the sewing machine, but still it kind of stayed balanced with this idea that also women could do it at home. And so if you wanted better clothes, if you wanted nicer clothes, and you did not have the means to do so, or you did not, or it wasn't available, perhaps, then you could do it yourself. And this idea of, do it yourself and have it, is also would also be very important.
Well, to move away from dressmaking in particular, this is related. One of your intriguing findings is the extent to which women use Singer machines in ways that Singer didn't imagine, and frankly weren't very happy with. Their notion is really the machine intersecting with domesticity in the home. The domesticity may change, but still there is that domestic ideal which is part of it. And you show that women found different ways and did different things with the machines than the company intended. Tell us about some of those practices, some of those challenges of Singer's notion.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say, and it's not only women, but it's because we don't know if it's only women or both women and men. But for example, for the case of Mexico, and this also goes within the argument of this planes between capitalism and gender, and is so the sewing machine that is that has all the accessories, right? Has the pedal, has the table, could have some drawers to put the your materials, and then it has a top also that could be put. So it has a lot of parts. It's a very also it's a furniture, right? It's a piece of furniture as well. So in Mexico, for example, these machines would be taken apart sometimes and be put in the pawn shop, right? And so salesmen in Mexico went crazy with this, because they would see the head only of the sewing machine in the pawn shop, and they would ask the person, the pawn shop owner, who gave you this? And they, this is all written in like legal cases, and it was a woman who had given it to them, but that she had assured them that they were going to be back for them, because it was a great business that she was doing with them, with sewing and whatever. And so and of course, I mean, Singer perhaps just lost all of these machines, and that were sold on credit, right? The other I guess way is this kind of collective usage of the sewing machine. This idea that the sewing machine should be in your house, and it's for just one person. definitely not how it worked in neither Spain nor Mexico, because, for example, there was this position of the costurera that would come to your house. Of course, higher, kind of middle to higher class families. And so everyone would use that sewing machine, but the costurera who would come to their house also used it. In towns, in little towns, for example, I don't have this in the book, but now I'm interviewing women. In a town, usually there were about 2 or 3 sewing machines. And if there were 50 houses, all of them would, perhaps use the same 3 sewing machines. So, but still, it was it was profitable for Singer. The fact that all these little towns would at least have 3 sewing machines. Yeah, and I can think of something else. Of course, the cases of embroidery, like how how they would make this and because it's a small book, and perhaps it's also the I don't know if it's the size but I couldn't put some of the pictures of embroidery, but there are amazing images of window fronts of embroidery, like for example, ships made of embroidery, and they supposedly were all made of in the sewing machines. So they were used as embroidery machines, right? The industrialization of embroidery, which now is very common. Now all embroidery that you see is made with machine, but a sewing machine that is made for plain sewing to be used in embroidery is a different thing.
We'll go back a minute about your towns. If you think about it, having 2 or 3 machines used by 50 people is an effort to make efficient use of a capital good. Because one of the problems always in business practices is you buy the machines, and if you let the machine sit idle, you're losing the possibility of generating profit from the use of this machine that you invested in. So in very capital intensive industries like steel, we know they run 24 hours a day to make use of all those expensive machines. So to have 2 or 3 machines that are shared by many people makes economic sense, because 2 or 3 families can't make full use of those machines just for their personal need. It makes sense in a much more sort of larger environment. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it suggests to me, again, this is related to talk to discussion of credit, that women use these machines, or women and men, as a form of business investment. That Singer's argument, and it's very much on this sort of family use, the embroidery, the women in the home, this middle class ideal, but it becomes transmuted or transformed into essentially capital goods for business enterprises, by women in this process.
Right, and that's what chapter 4 really talks about. So I mean, the book is a structure. It goes from global to local, right? So the last chapter talks about this sewing at home, which continues to be very important until, like I said, in Spain through the 1980s, especially because of the dictatorship and how, and the ideas about womanhood that were, the dominating ideas, but also in Mexico, right? I mean, historians of gender have explained this, how patriarchy is just gets modified, but it's not transformed with revolutions, unfortunately, right? There's not a change in how women continue to be relegated to a different position than men, even if the revolution perhaps claimed to be calling for more power and more visibility to women. So in the case of Mexico, continues also to be like that. But is this idea that in all of the ideological, throughout the ideological spectrum, right? Catholic womanhood in the case of Spain, and Mexican womanhood after the revolution, these women, because they were, offered to be professional in sewing, could actually make, a business for themselves, either in the house, or they created their own dressmaking academias, which is like schools, right? And or tiendas or stores. So if you ask anyone, in Spain about academias or modistas, it was part of their experience as women, like either as consumers or as makers. But it was not yet, everyone would have a story or at least a memory about it, and it's still today.
Well, I want to ask a couple more questions because it's fascinating, but I want to start bringing this to a close. But I want to ask you about Spain and Mexico. You mentioned early on that you were encouraged by your advisor to look at the margins, and partly that story is looking at gender and women, but partly you mentioned looking at Spain and Mexico. And your book is not just about Spain and Mexico. There's a lot about Singer internationally and the practices, and you sort of focus down on those two areas. What do you think it adds to your story that you have these cases in Spain and Mexico rather than, for example, say France and the United States?
Well, so I have gotten that question a lot, like why Spain and Mexico, right? And again, there's a direct answer, and it's that Singer's system was first formed in its, the vertical integration of the different. Well, actually, it was not. There was never production in neither Spain nor Mexico, but in the establishment of the selling structure, Singer, Spain and Mexico were the first in this Hispanic world that had it. So I want to be clear in that I don't mean to bring the case of Spain and Mexico to kind of say, okay, so they were also part of this development or this economic history of global capitalism, but also not, because if we look at less industrialized nations, we'll have to look at culture, because there is no other way. No, so the idea is, in my perspective, is to show that all these global processes have also a local story, and that is also it's neither more important or less important, but that we need to understand that to understand the whole process. If not, and it's also to tell the story from places where usually it's not told, right? This is the story of global capitalism. Usually you wouldn't find a history of global capitalism we would know with the case of Spain. Well, sounds like, it did happen, and there are, and Spain has its own experience of global capitalism, as Mexico does, and it's is as important as others. And it shows, again, different scenarios, right? Different planes and ways in which capitalism works and has worked in the last 2 centuries.
Very good. Well, the final question, your book is going to be read. You're going to be active for a while in the field. You may get questions or suggestions or thoughts as to what would broaden this, what would take the gendered capitalism vector, if you will, and widen it. How would a scholar who's thinking about this, likes your analysis, where might they go with this? Where might they look for perhaps other venues, other places, other sites of practices? Give us some advice for where someone might go if they want to pursue this analytic frame further.
So I think what's important is that, in my perspective, to understand business, and perhaps even more international business, where there's even more. Am I still connected?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay, I got this message.
You're-
Where there's even more diversity of mentalities, right? So when you talk about business, of course, there's a lot of social and cultural aspects to take into consideration. But when you do it in a transnational perspective, the diversity just grows and grows, right? There is different mentalities, there is different economies, there are different actors, political contexts. And so my advice would be to look deeper into these mentalities and cultural values, because there perhaps is the answer to why, you know, a corporation was created, for example, or how or why it had the business history that it had. So also in terms of archives and documents, I was, you know, I came from the other side, right? So for me, visual culture was key. But what I wanted to learn was, you know, how business was part of everyday life, but also how everyday life became also business and international business. So I had to go to not only the records of the multinational, which are in Wisconsin, and a very large collection also at the Soda House in Hagley. But in Hagley, you know, even the more visual sources are separated, right? So they are separated in the pictorial collection, where you have pictures and trade cards and of course the wonderful trade journals, which actually I have to do a shout out to Pamela Laird, who gave me that advice at the doctoral colloquium of the BHC. So, and that was kind of also the beginning of looking for more. I even have, you know, an experience of asking other scholars about sources, business sources, and, you know, and getting, no, there's nothing more. That's, you know, that's it. I was like, okay. Well, it turns out that the subsidiary or the Singer in Great Britain had developed this marketing review, you know, a magazine on marketing practices and experiences of different salesmen and saleswomen around the world. And they were all in Glasgow, you know, and I just went to Glasgow to see the old factory because I was interested in it, and went to the public library and asked. And I said, you know, is there anything for Singer? And I said, well, we have these pictures of the house of Isaac Singer, and then we have all these, I think it's 4 decades of monthly magazine. So just imagine, right? So, and that's it, and it's all about marketing around the world. So, and then of course, you know, I would say again, you know, all these little things hidden, like embroidery, or the, you know, the recipes from your house at your house that were gotten from your grandmother. All those things are, you know, are key, and especially again in the 19th and 20th century, when multinationals are just part of our lives. We could probably trace, you know, the commodity chain and of a lot of our things, and end up in a multinational or at least in a global, you know, market structure that could explain where it comes from.
So your answer is in part to think about the kind of practices you want to explore.
Exactly.
And think about how discussions of those practices are going to reverberate and manifest themselves in trade journals, catalogs, material culture, and large amounts of material that may not have anything to do with the corporation that's behind it.
Yeah. Also, one last thing is that it's oral histories, and I was not able to do that as much as I wanted for the book or the dissertation. And so, but now I'm doing it, now that I, you know, I'm not sure where they are going to go, but I'm doing it just, you know, to keep that record, because it's not there. It's not available, and at least I'll have it if anyone wants to use it in the future, or myself. But this idea of asking women, why do you sew? Like, what is it, you know? And the question is it's not easy for them either, because it's like, well, I do it because I learned how to do it. And so, but, you know, it would actually, I think it's going to make me think about that mentality. Why, because you're a woman, would you want to sew or embroider?
Well, terrific. We could talk for an hour, which I think is enough
Okay.
to put you through. This is a great book. I hope people buy it, read it. Gendered Capitalism, Sewing Machines and Multinational Business in Spain and Mexico. Paula A. Cruz-Fernandez. And if you decide to associate yourself in any way with this history conference, you will also see her in your inbox as a web editor, and we'll see more from her in her research. Paula, thank you for being with us and talking with us for so long.
Thank you so much.
And we will have more episodes of Active History Hangout coming up. Take care, and thanks for your interest.